learn how to do things a little differently then. So when you look at where we are today in America, and you look at the philosophers that you draw upon and the ideal of our founding, you know, the strains of thought and tradition that we're drawn on, where do you see today the biggest danger? Where have we gone wrong, and how might we correct it, short of everyone in America buying your book and reading it?
Well, that would certainly help towards the correction. I would say the biggest part that we've gone wrong is the administrative state. So we look specifically, and we can pinpoint the years 1937. The Great Depression is raging, and we are no longer ruled by our principles. We're ruled by, I'm hungry, I'm starving, FDR says he's going to fix it, we're going to just keep electing him over and over again, and he's going to die in office like a dictator. And he creates this vast bureaucracy that has rulemaking authority, it has enforcing authority, and it has judicial authority. And it's the administrative state has grown and it has shrunk, and it has grown and it has shrunk. But where we have gone the most wrong is allowing any part of our state to have two kinds of power or three kinds of power all in one. This is something Locke was very clear about. You need to separate the absolute power and the arbitrary power, the absolute power being the power over life and death, and the arbitrary power being the power to make the rules. They have to be separate. If they're together, then you can say, I've decided that wearing, you know, a white shirt's illegal now. Oh, haha, you're dead. Right? Not quite that simple, but kind of how that goes. And so when we stop separating those, the power to execute the law and the power to make the law is where we see things really start to go wrong. And so the path back is to shrink the administrative state. I'm a big believer in incrementalism. I don't think we can just wake up and decide it all disappears, poof, gone. But we need to be making very clear steps towards reducing not so much the amount of rules and regulations necessarily, but where those rules and regulations are coming from, specifically if they're coming from unelected bureaucrats who are unaccountable to the people.
So when you look at this book that you've put together, Foundations of Freedom, what would you hope, I mean, if you were to have an elevator pitch for perhaps an American who might be a little more, depressed about the current state of affairs, and maybe they think that perhaps our best days are behind us, what would you say to that person, not only to encourage them, but to make them interested in your book?
I would first mirror the words of my great-grandfather, Jaroslav Driha, who escaped communist Czechia. And he said, if I can't live in my homeland, I want to live under the U.S. Constitution because it is the single most important non-divinely inspired work in the history of mankind. That is the key, is we want to live under the Constitution. And so we need to understand why the Constitution is the way it is, and that's what we've kind of forgotten, is why does the Constitution do things? We kind of are seduced by these ideas of these leaders who are like, look, just give me the power, I'll solve the problems. The problems are part and parcel of human nature. Human nature has had problems for 10,000 years, and we will continue to have problems for 10,000 years. For as long as we live on this earth, until we kill each other in nuclear fire or the sun expands or whatever kills off humanity, we will have the same problems over and over again, because that's who we are. We're fallen creatures. But the Constitution, I think, is the first and the most effective way that has mitigated those problems. And so removing all of the things that we've done to weaken it is really why the Constitution did it that way. And that was kind of the goal with the book, is to understand not just the what, but the why. Because the why is almost more important than the what.
So it almost sounds like there needs to be a second book from you then, right? Because if these are the foundations of freedom, then is there another potential offering from you that goes into the nuts and bolts of how specifically these different threads and thoughts were pulled in? Or do you think that your just under 100-page book is sufficient?
It's sufficient for the foundation, but we all have to build on the foundation. And it's definitely something I'm researching, along with some other things that play more specifically into my Catholic faith and how we bring together the Catholic tendency to be quite liberal with the actual ideals of the Catholic Church and the ideals of our nation, because I think there's a lot more overlap there than most people would believe. And so, but kind of not just the nuts and bolts of how the Constitution work, but also how does it work today and how do we get back to it? Because it can't just be like, oh, I'm going to vote for whoever's on this side of the primary ballot, or I'm going to vote for Republicans over Democrats because I think that'll solve the problem, because it's a natural human impulse to collect power. And this is something both Republicans and Democrats are guilty of. And so it's not just about voting for the person with the right letter next to their name. It's really getting into that conversation and having that conversation with the people who are running. And so kind of maybe laying all of that open in an easy way for people to understand, not just the way like us people who are heavily involved in politics understand.
Let's perhaps explore some tangential territory. I mean, maybe we're going to go out on some thin ice together, but I think it might be elucidating for the audience. Let's go back about 150 years ago, and let's look at a strain of philosophy that happened after the founding, came out of Germany. You had people like Hegel and Marx, and they were obviously very influential. So given your prior, perhaps I'm going to argue, a little perhaps overly optimistic view of the progress of the understanding of human nature, I would argue that some of these philosophers represented kind of a retrograde. But how do you see the subsequent philosophies that came out of Germany and essentially created the modern political science studies here in America in the 1870s? Have you had a chance to look at that and kind of grappled with how that may have led to a critique of the Constitution and may have led to this government by professional bureaucrats?
Yeah, I have unfortunately had the experience of reading quite a bit of Hegel and quite a bit of Marx, which I do not recommend to anyone because it's not fun. But I think one of the key issues where Hegel and Marx go wrong is the importance of that understanding of we can always maybe incrementally increase our understanding. We will never perfectly understand human nature and make it perfect. And that's where Hegel and Marx go wrong, is they say, Hegel says, you just need to listen to me and the Germans, because the Germans are superior. And Marx just says, we just need to have our socialist revolution. And that disconnect between what we know about ourselves and what is, we will make it disappear. And we will know everything about ourselves. And because we have perfect knowledge of human nature, we can have perfect mastery, and then crime, poverty, jealousy, hatred, ambition, all of that will go away, and we will have a great bureaucracy that will do great things, much like the German state of the 1880s. Look at Otto von Bismarck, isn't he great? And so you see the German philosophers at that time, after Prussia reunited Germany, very prideful of their nation and believing that they were on the precipice of that true scientific discovery of what human nature is and how they can master it. And if you accept that idea that we can master human nature, then our Constitution is just a stepping stone to that. It is only the next best thing, or maybe second next best thing. If you accept this idea that we can master human nature and remove from it that ambition and that desire to gather power, then Hegel and Marx make perfect sense. Right? When you look at them in that sense, their conclusions are sound. It's just the problem is accepting the premise that we can actually know ourselves. And this is where Plato is very helpful through Socrates when he talks about the forms and the invisible line. And I give like an actual visual breakdown in the book. But essentially, Plato's concept is there is that which is, and we can only know that which is as well as a mirror reflects us. And I'm heavily oversimplifying it in his allegory of the divided line. But Plato's essential point is there is that which is, and we can grasp it, we can get a clear-ish picture of it, but we can never truly understand it. And that is human nature. Human nature is that which is. It is. It has always been, and it will always be. And so the fallacy, this false idea that, yeah, we just need to just a little bit further and we'll know it. We'll know it, and there will be nothing hidden to us, it's a very tempting thing, right? To think we're better than the past, we know better, therefore we can do what we want. But it's never going to actually work that way because we can't truly unlock that which is. And this is very similar. You take the allegory of the divided line, you apply, instead of saying that which is truth, as Plato did, you just put God there, sub God in for truth, and you're good to go, right? So Christians believe we can know most of God. God has revealed himself to us. But to pretend like we would actually know everything there is to know about God is heresy, because that's impossible. And so it's very similar with human nature. If we're pretending like the Germans did with Hegel and with Marx, and then leading into America with Dewey and Marcuse and a couple others, that we can know and master human nature. And then we see this idea that, of course, the bureaucrats would be right if they are truly masters of their nature.
Well, I can tell you, as someone who's been married for 35 years, I know that you can never truly master human nature. So I'm going to challenge you a bit here, because you talked about 1937 and FDR, and I would argue that the departure, the sharp departure from our heritage, really began a bit earlier. It began under President Woodrow Wilson, who was someone who was the president of a college and was our first and only political scientist who's been president, right? And it was Wilson who said that, because of course back then Darwinianism was in vogue, right? Mm-hmm. That government, that our Constitution would never survive if it was an animal, because it had organs set off in opposition to each other, and that organisms that thrive have to be working in harmony. In other words, all the internal organisms of an animal have to be working together, otherwise that animal isn't going to go forward and reproduce and be successful. And so he explicitly argued that our Constitution was obsolete, and that we needed to go for more of a scientific form of government. So tell me a little more about what, if you were to go back and let's say, bring Montesquieu into the present, and you were to say to Montesquieu, here's what's going on, what do you think? What do you think Montesquieu would be the most horrified of today if he were to show up in this audience and ask you a question?
Probably the TV, but if we're talking about the actual construction of our government, he would be terrified by the marriage of executive, legislative, and judicial power in some of these agencies, right? Not all of the agencies, but in some of them. Because over the areas that they regulate, they have functionally absolute power. And that's absolutely terrifying. And that is something we should all be much more cognizant of like, they cannot just be the lawmaker and the executor. They can be judge, jury, and executioner if they so wish. They have their own special courts and everything. That is something Montesquieu would be terrified of, because that is a cancer that will grow and encompass more. I'm going to push back a little bit on Wilson, because I think Wilson definitely casted those ideas, but so did Andrew Jackson, not quite 100 years prior, but many years prior. There have always been people casting ideas that the Constitution is bunk because it doesn't let me do what I want to do, because I'm right. I'm a man of the people. This is, Jackson, I'm a man of the people. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. And if the Supreme Court says no, I'm just going to camp the army out in front of them and ask what they're going to do about it.
Tell me about the Supreme Court's army, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so there have always been those people, but I would argue 1937, when the court bends the knee to FDR, is when it goes from I'm just man yelling at the sun like, dang you, Constitution, you're not letting me do what I want to, I'm going to destroy you one day. FDR is the one who finally goes in there and starts stomping on it.
Makes it happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. So if you were to, I'm looking at, again, how you arrived at this book through years of teaching, and how, again, it's just, I can't emphasize this enough. I was astounded when I read this book, right? Because you work with somebody and you think, come on, I work with this guy, right? I mean, I'm seeing him work with lawmakers and staff, and he's young, what the heck can a young guy know, right? And I'm reading this book and I'm like, holy Toledo, how in the heck did you pull this thing off, right? Because this is like, I don't know as if I would like add or take away a comma, right? I mean, this is really good stuff. And so if you look at what you've put together here, What would you say, for example, to someone who is campaigning for office or who has just won their office and they're putting together a team of people to help them as staff? Are there things that you would hope that if they grasped the truths in your book, that they might, for example, propose different sorts of legislation or maybe vote differently?
I would definitely hope for that. I would, and this is a line from some of my colleagues here that I'm somewhat shamelessly stealing. But as they're passing laws, as they're regulating this or regulating that, they need to remember that at the end of every regulation, and this is something our founders understood, is essentially the barrel of a gun. Eventually, even if it's a law against selling loose cigarettes or it's a property tax law, eventually, if you push back on that law long enough, the government's going to come in with people with weapons and tell you, do it or else. And so kind of understanding that framing and then looking at the framing of our Constitution and really questioning, is this something I want enforced down the end of a gun as they're voting for regulations, as they're voting to repeal regulations, as they're voting for new laws? That is kind of the key takeaway of like, government power is the force to kill eventually, like a legitimate kill, not murder. Do I want to empower the government to kill people or imprison people, or which is essentially, according to Locke, a way of killing them when you read through some of that? Do I want to empower the government to kill over this? And that is the big question I would ask to lawmakers as they're passing laws is, right. Do I want to enforce this with deadly force? And if the answer is no, then maybe we don't write that law.
It's interesting that you would use the example of selling loose cigarettes, because there was that infamous case out of New York City where someone actually did die at the hands of law enforcement who was selling loose cigarettes.
That's exactly why I used it, and I have to thank Chance, who is over here for alerting me to that.
Our resident freedomy guy. Yeah. It's like, it's one of those things. I know I've been to work in a given week if I've heard the phrase freedomy, because one of my colleagues is prone to use it, unironically, I might add. So I think that at this point, it would be just amazing to go to some questions in the audience, and perhaps let's warn the individual carrying the microphone that there are relatives of Austin Prochko in the audience. And so perhaps we should focus over here first, because I understand you may have both an aunt and an uncle, and I know your wife is here. Your brother is watching from Tokyo or something, right? So you have quite the home team here. So we have to make sure that not all the questions are going to be softball questions.
Of course.
So I'd like to kind of start where at least I think that the extended clan perhaps isn't over here, right? So you wouldn't lie to me, though, would you?
No, I would not.
Yeah, I don't know. That I'm a little suspicious about that, too. Yes, sir.
I was curious to know the organizations or administrations that hold these judicial, legislative, executive powers that you alluded to. Examples of them?
Yeah, so currently it is limited, but it has slowly grown. EPA has certain ways of exercising a regulation, and then they send out the guy to cite you for it, and then when you're cited for it, you're brought to the environmental court, which is run by the EPA, right? So that's a very convenient example. I think we're seeing that expand into some of the ways DOJ wants to act. It's not there yet, but we see, especially in the wake of all the crazy political turmoil that's going on right now, more of these agencies are wanting that ability because it's not fair that just the EPA gets to. We see in the IRS, they're hiring agents, and in that job description, I don't know if you've read it, some of these agents are required to carry a gun and be ready and willing to use deadly force if necessary. I very much do not like the idea of my tax collector showing up with a gun ready to shoot me if necessary. And so that's one of those ideas of they're carrying right now legislative, they can regulate, and executive force. They don't necessarily have judicial force yet, but you could argue some of the ways the EPA affects the economic courts and the tax law courts, that is judicial force. And so right now we're seeing primarily a marriage of executive and legislative, but more are bringing in the specialized courts because our court system is just so overworked. How can we expect our judges to do everything? These agencies, they're the subject matter experts, so it's really faster for everyone involved if they do it themselves.
Yeah, the guillotine was fairly fast too, though, right?
It was effective and very humane.
Yeah, yeah. Any other questions over here?
Howdy. So throughout the talk, you've alluded to that kind of opposite of Marx, and that as humans, we are always approaching that access of like zero, but we're trying to more and more understand ourselves, but that we won't fully understand ourselves, right? So extending what you said logically, since Machiavelli, Montesquieu, Locke, since our own Constitution, then you would arguably say that since that time, we've had a more thorough understanding of ourselves since that time. So have you come across anything that maybe since the founding of our own American freedom, since our Constitution, that maybe as a helpful critique that you would say, hey, we have this other further understanding of ourselves that maybe we would add to our Constitution now?
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll start with there are examples of that happening with the Constitution, right? I mean, in the 1920s, we went, oh, wait, women are people too, they can vote, right? And so, like, there have been additions to the Constitution as we've progressed through knowledge that, we ban slavery, we allow everyone to vote, we have women voting, right? We have those things, and that's what is part of the brilliance of the Constitution, is it does have the amendment process. As far as another governmental construction that really lays out an understanding of human nature, I've been looking for one. I haven't found one yet. I'm confident that there will eventually be one, but I think we're looking, as you get closer and closer to zero, the amount of time you have to move before there's any appreciable drop is very long. And so I'm confident for the next 100,000, 10,000 years, the Constitution is going to be the best expression of that, because it is looking at 3,500 years of political philosophy and politics. And that, as I said, I think we did most of our learning with the Greeks coming in a little bit as the Christians kind of took over. And then it's been very slow since then because you grasped at that, right? And then we're mostly there. We've polished the mirror very clearly. There might be a speck here and there, but for the most part, we understand humans as a people. We like to gather power, we like to help our friends, and we like to harm our enemies. And so reducing the avenues for people to do that is, I think, what is paramount to creating a just form of government. And that's what the Constitution does when it is properly applied. And obviously, it's not been properly applied for almost 100 years now. But we can get back to that. It's actually, I would argue, not that difficult. It is very difficult, but not, hey, let's start having a revolution and blood flowing in the streets difficult.
So following on that question, thank you for that question, by the way. This is a good question. By the way, audience, that's like a standard for the rest of you to meet when you ask a question, okay? So what about Friedrich Hayek? Okay, so do you view his critiques of the modern, for lack of a better term, welfare state as limited to economics, or do you think he was speaking more broadly in his works, The Fatal Conceit and The Road to Serfdom? Because I kind of think that perhaps Hayek, just like Montesquieu, was commenting on forms of government and how they perhaps were suboptimal for human flourishing.
Yeah, that's a tough one because it's been a very long time since I've read Hayek, and so I'm probably going to make a fool of myself trying to answer it completely. Go
on.
Yeah, sure. I think a lot of Hayek's observations and criticisms can be very accurate, but I also think there's a certain extent where you look at our state and we look at the problems we're running into. There's a lot of people whose criticisms are accurate, but then not necessarily always are their solutions the best solution. And I do look at Hayek a little bit more economically than as a criticism of the function of the Constitution as it is, because again, we've gotten so far away from that. And so returning to that could help remove some of those problems that he was actually looking at.
Yeah, I guess I would argue that that one of the concepts he brings to the fore probably would work very nicely with some of the things you've already said, which is that the central planning, for example, presupposes that you have near perfect knowledge about what's actually going on. And that what he argued was that this spontaneous order that comes out of humans living together is able to do things that cannot even be remotely replicated by a central organizing principle saying we're going to make 10 million shoes and we're going to make 15 million socks, and that's somehow going to meet demand. Because when you think about it, that can be extended to other areas. And I'm trying to remember, perhaps you could help me out here, because there was some philosophers, I think in the Greek period, that talked about, and it could have been the Roman Republic period, that talked about the level of granularity of the law being a symptom of a society that is beginning to fail, right? That when customs and traditions, where people just do it naturally, right, have to be replaced by increasingly detailed law saying this is how you're going to act, right? That's a problem, and I think you could trace that back to some of Friedrich Hayek's critiques of economic planning.
I would agree there. So it is Roman Republic, right? It's this idea that you have the 12 tables of Rome. It's 12 tablets with all the laws that Romans need to have. And if there's any ambiguity, then it gets worked out in the court system, right? And it only works like that as long as the Romans are kind of a more homogenous people that all acts similarly. And as you start seeing, not going to get too much into the history, as you start seeing the Gracchi brothers, and then leading up to Julius Caesar, that all falls apart. On Hayek's, the central planning, it just doesn't work. We've seen it over and over again with the fall of various Soviet and communist states, that central planning doesn't work. And even the nominally communist party of China, it doesn't centrally plan anymore. It's realized that doesn't work. It just controls, which is slightly different than the planning.
Right. Yeah, heaven help you. Well, it seems to me like we may be going to relatives now. So.
Is it possible that the Constitution is the blueprint for government that can only work here? Because when you open some atlases going back a century, there have been a whole lot of states created, including out of the falling of the Soviet Union, that can't seem to pull it off, even with this model in place, and they still all want to come here.
I would say the guiding principles of the Constitution are universal, but the actual practical form of, we have our Article 1 is the legislative, right? When we look at the actual granular parts of the Constitution, it's not going to be universally applicable. And that's something Montesquieu actually addresses really well, as he says, when you're constructing a government for a people, you have to know the people well as well, right? You can't go to and do what we tried to do, which is go to Afghanistan, kick out the local rulers and say, all right, y'all are going to be just like America. It's totally going to work. It didn't work at all. And so those guiding principles are the same, but how you adapt those guiding principles to various peoples is where the devil is really in the details. And so it is very difficult. I think the Constitution does it best, and that is partially a character of the American people at the time of the Revolution. But it is also something that's not been fully replicated anywhere else.
Well, that's great, because your uncle, is it, right?
Yes.
Actually asked one of the few questions that we talked about prior to coming on stage here that I didn't get to. And it was almost as if I asked it myself. So I'm very glad that your uncle asked it, because one of the things I was looking at was exactly that with Afghanistan. My understanding is that the Constitution was drafted by some of our French NATO partners, and it was very centralizing in a culture and society whose tradition was very much that of a confederation or a very loose-knit government, allowing maximum sort of flexibility to the tribal leaders and the different regions and ethnic groups within that nation. And I think it's fascinating that it was done to begin with, because I think it shows a certain amount of hubris to somehow think that we can take our own experience through, as we mentioned earlier, right, hundreds of years of religious wars in Europe, and the Syrian experience that eventually led to the series of events that culminated in the Declaration and the Constitution, and that we can somehow take and just plop that down in the middle of a foreign land. And I think that the impetus to do that is actually related somewhat to some of the problems we've gotten ourselves into now with the administrative state. You know, this thought that you can somehow know everything, and that because you went to an Ivy League school that perhaps, you know, your level of understanding is superior.
Yeah, it's just very prideful, right? And it's this idea that because we know best, and this is very Wilsonian, right? Or we have evolved the furthest, and therefore we know the best. And that's something we have to be very careful to avoid. I would say and this is part and parcel of where we are today, is we think we know better than these men who spent their lives not only researching and reading what would be the best form of government, but fighting and dying for it. Well, we know better now because, you know, it's 2023, right? You know, we just know better. And we do away with the Constitution, or we try to do away with the Constitution, and look at where we are, right? I would say we have, at least the past 3 or 4 years, chaos on a grander scale than even many of our founding fathers had with stuff like the Whiskey Rebellion.
In the back here.
So I do have to ask about the woke crowd. And so this is the question. So the current academia and various parts of larger businesses, government agencies, et cetera, have obviously, they haven't read your book. They don't have the current traditional understanding of the American founding. They certainly don't have the traditional understanding of American separation of powers. The woke crowd has a very different view. And I'd like to talk about a specific Italian, a different Italian than Machiavelli. There's Antonio Gramsci, one of the leading intellectual founders of the cultural hegemony theory of social organizations. And how best do you think, particularly given your experience in education, can we try to start counteracting the current hegemony of the woke crowd?
I think first, by realizing the woke crowd, like at its core, is a single-digit percentage of the population. They're very loud, and they're very proud of that, but they don't actually hold true controlling power in the sense of being a majority. And so part of that is keeping ourselves educated, educating our friends, educating our family, getting people engaged. I mean, for Lord's sake, more people voted in American Idol than they did in the presidential election. Like, more alive people, I guess, voted in American Idol than in the presidential election. And so getting people who are viewing things more engaged is a big part of that. But the other part of it is realizing, like, looking at our freedoms and saying our freedoms apply to everyone. And what the woke crowd wants to do is they want to seize power and enforce their way of life on us, right? They want to grab the power and then force us to be like them. And so our natural response is what? Okay, well, I'm going to take power and I'm going to force you to be like me. But then we've created an apparatus that can be seized. And so we have, as conservatives, I think, to a certain greater or lesser extent, failed in this duty over the past 100 years, where we say, just put us in charge and we'll do things the right way. We'll do it the correct way. We'll get people to think the right way. And so we'll increase government power so that people are doing things the right way. And then what happens? We lose an election. We lose control of that power. And then the woke crowd uses that to enforce things on us. I think looking at Donald Trump's presidency, he shrunk the government in some ways, but he expanded it in other ways. And now we see Biden using that expanded power for his own ends. And so the big question and the big thing we should be looking for is not to expand the size of government and the abilities of government to do what we want it to do, but when we're looking at that power, and this is kind of the last chapter of my book where I talk about this, when we're looking at power, we say, would I like this power if it was used against me? And if the answer is no, then we don't want to give the government that power. And so really, I'm making the case for, and I don't know who it is, I don't think there's anyone on the national stage who is this, I'm making the case for a modern Cincinnatus, a modern George Washington, who's willing to take the reins of power and being told, you're amazing, we love you, we will give you anything you want. And they say, that's great. I'm going to do what's needed. I'm going to destroy the power behind me, and I'm going to go live on my farm. Right? That's what we need. And I don't know who that is. But that's really the direction we need to be begging our leaders to take us. And we have a lot of actual power in that. That is where probably another book is due, is like practically one vote out of millions, okay, not that big of a deal, but how that vote can affect the other votes in a clear, concise way, while also respecting the fact that all of us are working or parents or just busy. How can we do that without dedicating our life to being on a campaign?
We may have time for one more question down front here. Thank you.
Why do you think that person hasn't presented themselves yet?
I would say probably it's human nature. Most of the people that are actually wanting power are wanting power, right? And so the way our national stage works is it incentivizes those who want to consolidate power to come out. And I don't know what the practical answer is to do that filter, to bring us to a modern Cincinnatus, a modern George Washington. But we have to remember, George Washington didn't want to run for president. He was told he needed to because the nation needed him. We see Cincinnatus, he was an effective Roman general, and then he goes, okay, cool, I beat the enemy, I'm gonna go live on my farm. And then Rome is in shambles, and they say, Cincinnatus, please, we're begging you, come back, take charge. And so he takes charge, he solves the crisis, and he says, all right, y'all, bye again. Right, and he goes back to his farm. And so, to a certain greater or lesser extent, a person with the right characteristics isn't going to self-select and emerge. Because anyone who's willing to self-select and emerge has at least a little bit of that pride of, I'm better than the other people in this field, and I'm willing to put myself out there. And that's often a good thing, right? That's not to say all politicians are evil, but like the kind of once in 1,000 years politician we need is not going to self-select. We're going to need to find someone who's good in a crisis, who has a proven track record of that, and name ID who's not interested in power, and then come on our knees to them and be like, please, we need you. And I don't know who that is. I legitimately don't. 28. Not quite old enough yet. No, ma'am. But I may have a little bit of that pride in me. I mean, I did write a book, right? So I think I am.
You know, Joe Biden was first elected to the U.S. Senate when he was 29. He couldn't even take office for a little bit until he became 30. So, yeah. Well, if he told the truth. Well, thank you all so much for coming here today and enjoying this book talk with my remarkable colleague, Austin Prochko. Something that I learned how to say due to Austin's background and proclivities is Slava Ukraini, right? So that's something that we follow in our spare time. The Foundations of Freedom, the Layman's Guide to the Philosophy of the American Founding. I understand you'll be signing some books out afterwards here, right? And you'll be personalizing these books.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's great. Have you ever done that before?
I've signed a few, but not a ton.
But not for a crowd of adoring people.
No, sir.
All right. This is great. So thank you all so much for spending your lunch hour with us. And again, it's my great honor and pleasure to have been able to moderate this book talk with my colleague. This is really a remarkable book. Again, word for word, an amazing job of distilling the essence, the philosophical essence behind the founding of our great republic. And if everyone had a chance to just spend even 3 hours with this book, I think our nation would be much the better off for it. So congratulations on a great effort, Mr. Prochko.
Thank you, sir.